checking if this thing was hot. So he saw this operation going on. Here's the full color rendering of what it may have looked like. Ground was still hot when they got there. And we'll go to the second view here. Now you can see this UH-1 helicopter in clear view with the spotlight shining down back in 1964. He also mentioned that during the retrieval operation, this is the M123 tank transporter that was used to move it from the crash location. Others who saw this going down Camp Forsyth stated that they saw people in biological hazmat suits associated with this particular crash retrieval operation. Southwest, July 3rd, 1967. This was a Marine. His rank was a private first class. Now, this is a Southwest location. This particular gentleman was guarding a Quonset-style hut. He had landed in an unimproved runway. Windows were blacked out. Off to the left, there were 3 tents. There was a kind of hastily constructed, prefabricated building and a Quonset-style hut. He was told to guard this particular facility, but by day 3, curiosity got the best of this guy. So he kind of went over inside. He pulled open this flap, looked inside, and he saw a very interesting craft that was 30 feet in diameter. It had a dome on top. Right in front of this craft were tables with instruments on there. There were calipers, there were different micrometers. It looks like they were testing the tensile strength of this craft. Off to the right, which you'll see over here, there was a walk-in freezer with body bags. He did not see any ET bodies, but this is what he described, and this is the full color rendering of what this may have looked like if we were actually there back in 1967. Probably Southwest, probably Arizona location, and you can see these workbenches with these calipers and micrometers, different tensile strength material. Norton Air Force Base, 1973. Air Force photographer. This is page 160, case 14. Now, this particular photographer, he was at Hawaii at the time. All of a sudden, he had his security clearance upgraded. He was flown from Hawaii to Norton Air Force Base, San Bernardino, California. There he was joined with another Air Force photographer. They go into this Air Force vehicle, and they drive 1 hour from San Bernardino, California, and all of a sudden, the car stops completely. They drop down into an underground facility, and this is what they see. They both get out of this car. They disrobe completely nude. Now they're wearing these medical laboratory smocks, and they're led into this large underground facility where there's a crane. The crane has a netting, and it's supporting about 15 feet off the floor, a 30-foot diameter disc-shaped craft, and his job was to go inside this craft, photograph the interior. Now, when they both got in here, this is his direct quote. Keep in mind, this is 30 feet in diameter. I could have thrown a football as hard as I could and not hit the other side. So there was something going on in the interior of this craft that made it appear at least 10 times larger on the inside than it was on the outside. So some type of space warp, some type of continuum going on. This is something we've heard before as well. So something that looked to be about maybe 300 feet. Now, this is the full color rendering of what this retrieval operation may have looked like at this underground facility. You can see the craft being supported by the netting. We'll go ahead and move to the next rendering here, a little bit more of a blow-up. Shows you what this may have looked like. And then I want to take you inside. This is what it may have looked like. If this thing was so large that you could throw a football, this may be what it looks like on the interior of this craft. So his job was to photograph all the interior display panels, all the interior components. Once that was done, they were also told to photograph 3 ETs that were involved in an alien autopsy. So not only did he photograph the interior of the craft, but he was involved in the autopsy as well. So we've all heard these reports that these underground facilities are connected by high-speed tunnel system. Is there any way we can back this up with any kind of evidence here? So this is Los Angeles Times, July 1972. Tube shuttle using electromagnetic suspension, LA to New York in half an hour, 10,000 mile an hour tunnel train plan developed. This is the cutaway that shows you how this thing works. They're using a vacuum to suck out all the air. and they can get this thing up to about 10,000 miles an hour. And this is in the early 70s by LA Times. Do we have anything else to back up this whole concept of these underground dumb facilities being linked up here? This is Project RAND, Proceedings of the Second Protective Construction Symposium, Deep Underground Construction, and this is Volume 2, March 24th, 25th, 26th, 1959. This is their own publication telling us here. This is what they're saying. Just as airplanes, ships, and automobiles have given man mastery of the surface of the earth, tunnel boring machines and shaft sinkers will give him access to the subterranean world. It is our aim to provide machines which will supply the ever-increasing demand in mining and construction of underground facilities. So in their own publications, the RAND publication, they're telling us that they're doing these tunnel boring machine operations. It's a done deal. We've got it in their own documents. Another actionable item here. Senators and congressmen with the appropriate security clearances should locate this facility, find out what is stored there, and what other underground installations this may be connected to. Absolutely. This is another case that was within Dr. Greer's archive. I want to give him credit for this one. U.S. Marine Corps diver off the coast of Okinawa back in 1991. They were detecting radiation at a depth of 1.5 miles below the surface. That's pretty deep. So what he ends up doing is he gets in a DSRV. They dive down to a depth of 1.5 miles. And when they get there, this is what they see. They see a triangular-shaped craft, a little bit bigger than an F-14 fighter. It had been resting at the bottom, they thought, for between 40 to 50 years because they could see the silt buildup. So this thing was there for decades. They eventually did retrieve it, and the commanding officer, here's our full-color rendering, gives you an idea what this thing looks like, believes it absolutely was an ET craft. There were hieroglyphic lettering on the side of the craft that they couldn't determine what that was. So this is an interesting case from the 90s. Now, we want to move on to McClellan Air Force Base. This is 1973. Chris Coffey was a very interesting person because this particular individual was friends with test pilot Ellison Onizuka. This is page 153, case 3. This is Ellison Onizuka. Now, many of you might know this gentleman. Probably everybody is familiar with this gentleman. He was at this particular facility where they brought about 12 pilots into a briefing room. They shut down the lights. And then there was an Air Force general in the background who started a movie projector, and projected on the forward wall was about a 5-minute black and white film that depicted at least 2 ET bodies in an autopsy setting. And he was thinking, I can't believe I'm seeing this. Here you can see Ellison Onizuka right here. He was shocked at this. This was another independent source here talking about strange things going on at McClellan Air Force Base. David Armstrong claims his aunt used to work for a top-secret UFO records library at McClellan Air Force Base. In his 20s, Armstrong went to visit her, and knowing he had an interest in the subject, Armstrong says his aunt let him take a look at the files. They had video evidence, they had photographs, they had documents, they had files on UFOs and UFO crash retrievals. So back to Ellison Onizuka. Leonard Stringfield was within 2 weeks of getting this gentleman's testimony, but he died on January 28th, 1986 in the Challenger incident. We almost got his testimony. We were about 2 weeks too late. And then, of course, here's Challenger. Now, I took the drawing and I took the testimony from Chris Coffey that came directly from Ellison Onizuka. I tracked down his widow, sent her a letter with the drawing. I never got a reply. So I don't know if she didn't get the letter, but she may have. It would have been great to get her testimony for the record as well. Source here is Air Force pilot, late 1950s time frame, Ed Komarek Jr. He conducted the interview. This is a 5 to 6 minute movie clip, and what this depicted within this interview is this Air Force personnel stated that he saw a 60-foot diameter dish-shaped craft. It had a hull breach on the top section of the dome where we believe the propulsion system came outside the craft, so this might have been a high impact. There were 3 ET bodies near toward the side of the outer rim of the craft itself. This is the blow-up that gives you an idea of what this may have looked like if we were there today. Now, we want to talk about the other Roswell. We don't want to talk about just cases here in the U.S. This is spring 1955, across the Texas-Mexican border around Del Rio, Texas. Now, we had a group of B-47s that were heading westbound. There were 3 of them. They were escorted by 4 F-86 Sabre jets. This is heading westbound over southern Texas. And all of a sudden, this disc-shaped craft comes screaming by their flight path. One of these F-86 pilots peels away from the group. He gets clearance to do that. He does a low approach over the crash scene. He flies back to Carswell Air Force Base, gets out of his F-86, goes to Corsica, jumps into a tail dragger Aranca twin aircraft, and flies back to the crash site before it gets dark. And he got a real good look at this entire scene. This is what it looked like when he got there. This disc was about 25 feet in diameter. The dome had popped off. You can see over here on the foreground right side is the Aranca. He came with a friend, and the Mexican military got there before America did at the time. So that's how this went down. Now, as it was getting darker, it started getting colder. And according to this gentleman, what these Mexican soldiers were doing to keep themselves warm is they were taking blankets from their truck. They were putting it on the debris from the craft that was still warm, pulled it off the debris, and then put them on their bodies to warm them up, which I thought was a very interesting point. Why would you make up such an unusual point? To me, that has at least the ring of truth here. So this is the testimony from Robert Willingham, Air Force pilot. He stated when he looked inside the breech of this craft, he saw 4 bodies with, quote, arms that looked like broomsticks. That's how he described it. Now I want to take you further inside, and we're going to show you what the full color rendering of the scene looks like. We've got the Aranca there, we've got the troop transport, we've got the Mexican soldiers there, and now we want to go inside, and this is what it looked like. It was a gruesome sight. This is not for the faint of heart, but this is what it may have looked like if they were actually there. Now, there was another crash retrieval operation that took place called the Coyame incident. I want to give credit to Noe Torres and also my good friend Ruben for doing the research on this one. A Cessna 172 took off from southern Texas, was heading southbound. Coincidentally, a disc-shaped craft was heading northbound. And this thing was going 2,530 miles an hour at an altitude of 75,000 feet, heading northbound. It dropped down to the same exact altitude of the Cessna 172, right around 12,000 feet, and there was a mid-air collision. Both craft came down. While all this is going on, the Mexican military is beginning their retrieval operation. But United States intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, they're monitoring the radio traffic. So they're aware of all this. They got a good handle on what's going on here. Now, while the Mexican Army is loading up this craft onto this 18-wheeler tractor-trailer, they've got a couple of Jeeps up front. They have the craft now on the 18-wheeler, and they're moving it out. And all of a sudden, something bizarre takes place. The entire convoy completely stops dead in their tracks. And all of these Mexican soldiers are dead. They're outside the vehicle. They're slumped over on the steering wheel column. One guy's hanging outside of a door. They're all dead. There was some type of biological agent associated with this particular operation. However, American intelligence agencies, they knew what was going on. They had a reconnaissance flight that flew over this operation, so they already knew. So what they did is they took 3 UH-1 helicopters and 1 CH-53. They attached a lasso to it and flew it back to CDC headquarters, and that's how that went down. So these are the deepest of the black programs when the United States military goes out and steals up from under the nose of another government a crash retrieval asset, the deepest black programs within these operations. These are the helicopters that were involved in the retrieval operation. 3 Bell UH-1 Hueys, 1 CH-53 Sea Stallion flew the CDC headquarters in Georgia. Now, this is the full color rendering of what it looked like if we were there. We've got the CH-53 taking this thing away, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the top view looking down with a 45-degree look-down angle. Just an incredible type operation. Fort Dix, McGuire Air Force Base. This is New Jersey, January 18th, 1978. Sergeant in the Air Force Security Police. This is page 131. Now, this is a nighttime operation The morning of, there was multiple UFO sightings that were confirmed by General George Filer. So he's still alive. He can confirm that this beginning part of this operation absolutely did take place. Now, as this MP is making his rounds around the outer perimeter fence of this facility, he notices something coming out of the darkness. And he gets out his .45 caliber pistol and he shoots this thing. You can see that's what this X is over here. Whatever this was, it climbed over the fence and died over here at the McGuire Air Force part of the base. And it was at the unimproved, deserted runway. That's where this being died. And this is the area of vicinity of where this actually took place. Here is the drawing that depicts what took place. This being was about 5 feet tall, had an interesting head, kind of that tapered to the top. Once they discovered the body on the other side of the chain link fence, they built a crate around this body. They sprayed this with a preservation chemical. They put the crate with the body into a metal container, and they moved that metal container into the aft cargo bay of a C-141 Starlifter and flew it to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So we'll move to the next slide here. That shows you what this looked like at the aft end section of where this craft actually brought it back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. UFO crash retrievals, 1942. So we're way earlier than Roswell here. We're 5 years prior to Roswell. And this is at an Army base north of Georgia that not even Leonard Stringfield knew about. And in this particular report, this craft was about 15 feet tall. It was 10 feet high. It had 3 levels. The upper level had this, if you look at the enlargement here, it had a display panel with buttons, switches, dials, kind of this display panel. The mid-deck had what looked like 4 bar stools wrapped around a outer type window that was directly in front of these bar stools. The lower deck had an entryway hatch that was, again, fully integrated into the craft itself. Now, as this thing came down, it damaged the top section of the craft and caused a hull breach. There were also 4 crew members that were taken alive. They later died, but they were about 5 feet tall, 90 pounds, and about large black eyes, milky white skin is what they look like. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, 1946. This is a young boy, Tex Martin. This is page 242, 243. His father was an electrical contractor, and they were working. He brought his son to the base that day, and something started happening here. This 6-year-old boy was talking to a janitor, and this janitor said, would you like to have a soda? And he asked his father, this janitor would like to get me a soda, and he said, yeah, go ahead, you can do that, you can do that. So this janitor gets this boy, he's only 6 years old, he gets him this soda, and concurrently while he's drinking his soda, there's a connecting doorway from the cafeteria inside the facility at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, and he was at the exact right time at the right place. And as this door opened up, what he saw inside was a disc-shaped craft. There were other debris that were tarped on 18-wheeler tractor-trailer lowboy trucks. That's what he saw. These are some of the very early renderings we did based on the eyewitness testimony. There were a couple of bodies kind of laying on the floor with body bags. They were covered up, and we'll go to the full color rendering a little bit here, but this is what this craft looked like, 20 feet in diameter. It had 2 raised sections wrapped around the outer circumference of the craft, had tripod landing gear leg, and then these bodies that were on these stretchers that he could just get a good look at that. We want to move on to the next color rendering here. If we were there, if we were this young boy that you can see in the background, what he may have seen as a reverse perspective here. Just incredible. So we're already prior to Roswell with this particular case. Carrot Patch, south of Salinas, California. This is July, August 1947. This was seen by 2 19-year-old workers in a nearby field. Now, it had come down the night before. They didn't know anything about this until the foreman approached these 2 19-year-old boys and said, you know, we've got something that came down here. We better take a look at this thing. This is the original sketch that went with the report. 9 feet in diameter. It was 4 feet tall. It had 2 sections of indented windows wrapped around the outer circumference of the craft itself. And then we'll move on to the X marks the spot location. We've got the map of where this thing actually came down, just to give you a good idea here. Here is the AutoCAD drawing that shows you what this may have looked like. Again, 9 feet in diameter, about 4 feet tall. Here is our original sketch that gives you an idea. Now, when the military got there, within about 15 minutes, they ushered these 2 boys out of the location, but not too far away that they didn't get to see the retrieval operation. They saw the entire operation. They saw them lifting this craft up onto the trailer and moving it out of the area. So they got a good location. This is our full color rendering of what this retrieval operation may have looked like if we were actually there and could see this. C-119 flying boxcar. This is Sierra Madre, California. What he ended up seeing is he was asked by the United States military to aid in a retrieval operation, and so he did assist them. This is page 32. So they walk over to this C-119 flying boxcar, and how do we know what the diameter of this craft was? Okay, we can pretty much gauge that the diameter of the craft was 9 feet, because the aft cargo bay of a C-119 flying boxcar is 9 feet 10 inches. You still need 5 inches of clearance on either side, so you can't be any larger than 9 feet. It was a relatively small craft. This is what it may have looked like as they were loading it up to ramp. This is the aft cargo bay view now. We're getting ready to load this craft in there. He said that there were at least 3 bodies recovered. They were burnt. In fact, he said that when he went to touch their faces, the skin came out and connected to his fingers. So it was kind of a gruesome scene. But this is our full color rendering of what this scene may have actually looked like here. And we'll move to the full color rendering of this particular retrieval operation. So very interesting case. It's within the Stringfield files. Another one of these good cases here. Now we've got Naval Air Station, Sunnyvale, California. This is 1950, Hangar 1. He was a radar operator. UFO crash retrievals, case B5, page 57. Now, this gentleman was also at the right place at the right time. He went through this double doorway, and what he saw, we've got his direct quote here, "It was certainly no aircraft of ours." So as he's going through this facility, he goes through this double door, and he sees this craft, about 80 to 100 feet in diameter. It had an upper dome, and it had a series of windows wrapped around the outer circumference of this lower dome section. He was challenged by the guard and told to vacate the area, but he did get a good look at this craft. Now we want to talk about this gentleman. Former military officer. He was at an unknown U.S. Air Force Base in a classified materials library. This is page 212 to 213. So this gentleman is opening up this cabinet. There's a file that had specific details on UFO crash retrievals. There was a report, and there was one black and white photograph. And I want to take you to this black and white photograph here. This may be what it looked like. The report said that this dish-shaped craft came down in Farmington, New Mexico prior to 1950. Farmington is very interesting in this whole case study here. This was about 36 feet in diameter. There was a slight pencil-sized hole on one of these porthole windows, and they did gain access to the craft itself. So that's important to note. Now, these are the key points to take away from this particular case. Number one, military officer had the correct security clearance, which gave him access to a classified materials library. Number two, report seen by witness made reference to crashes and that bodies were recovered. So now we've got more than one. Number three, in addition, diamond-tipped drill bits and acetylene torches were used to gain access to the interior. Reference 1946 craft seen at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and 40-foot diameter craft guarded by a U.S. Marine during December 1963. 4 is important. Eventually, technicians were able to gain access to the interior of the craft by way of a small entry hatch. The report said, referring to the door, that it was almost as if the material of the craft liquefied and then solidified again. So here again is another reference to these hatchway doors these different type of seams that are so fully integrated into the craft itself, you could not see where the seam actually is. Now, hundreds at Farmington report large force of flying saucers. Albuquerque Journal, March 18th, 1950. If anyone's done any research on this, this is an absolute watershed case because there were over 500 flying saucers that flew over Farmington at this time. It was called the Farmington Armada. Literally hundreds of eyewitnesses saw fleets of these flying saucers flying over, making 90-degree right angle turns. It was an incredible sighting. That coincides with what we have over here. During the early 1950s, there was a direct order from the United States Air Force to our pilots to shoot these flying saucers down. Here we've got shoot saucers down. Jets ordered in 24-hour alert. This is Cincinnati Enquirer, July 29th, 1952. Other newspaper clippings, and there's hundreds of these. Jets keeping 24-hour alert for saucers. Pilots ordered to down objects if they don't land. On the saucer trail, pilots told shoot them down. Jets on 24-hour alert to shoot down saucers. So this would have been the aircraft that they were using at the time. This is an F-94 Starfire that they would be using to try to intercept these craft. And this is what it looks like if you go to the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson. You can see off to the left we've got the rocket sections concealed. Over to the right is the Air Force Museum, Dayton, Ohio, where we've got the louvers revealed, showing you where the rockets would come out for an attempted intercept. Now, what would this look like? It would look something like what we see here. This type of an intercept is what they would have been involved in back in the early 1950s. Call went out from the Air Force to our pilots. Now, this is interesting, and this came from a letter from Mildred Bissell, October 2nd, 1979. This is a letter to Leonard Stringfield. We'll go over this very briefly here. It says, I heard you speak at the MUFON Symposium in Dayton last year, and I am interested in your research on retrievals of the third kind. I gave a talk at a local library last week, and in the discussion period following, a fellow told me that when he was a gunner in the Air Force, he had emptied his guns on a UFO and had taken pictures with his gun camera that clearly showed the shells exploding against the side of the craft. He said the camera was taken off the wing of his plane when it landed, and the pictures developed. At 2 a.m., a couple of military policemen came and got him out of bed and took him to the base auditorium. They ran the 17-second of movie of the UFO over and over and questioned him and two other crew members until 10 a.m. He was warned never to tell anyone what had happened. He said he had a wife and family, a good job, and a lot to lose. He seemed afraid of the CIA and wouldn't even give me his name. So here's a report from an Air Force pilot absolutely confirming that he was there. He unloaded an entire magazine of shells on this craft. It hit the side of the craft, and they got it all on gun camera footage. So how many of these type situations have we had from World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, Desert Storm, where they have the gun camera footages? And where are these particular films now? Want to mention Marina Popovich, Soviet Air Force colonel, engineer, and decorated test pilot. Want to give her credit for coming forward to talk about this next case. This is page 245 as the reference. She mentions this particular gentleman. This is Major General Igor Maltsov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Defense Troops, and he had highlighted a very interesting UFO encounter. This is March 21st, 1990, near Moscow. Two MiG-23 jet fighters were attempting to intercept a 650-foot diameter dish-shaped craft. This is over Moscow back in 1990, confirmed by Russian military sources. Miami Herald, July 8th, 1990. So I started digging, trying to get some additional confirming evidence here. Soviets more serious about sightings. Over here it says, Maltsev also reported that jet fighters were scrambled and the pilots described a disc from 100 to 200 meters in diameter flying at speeds 2 to 3 times faster than their aircraft, Holiness said. The general concluded that the UFO had somehow, and I love this part, quote, come to terms with gravity and that it didn't seem to appear to be a terrestrial machine. So It had come to terms with gravity. That's interesting wording that we should keep in mind. Very interesting. Now, Great Lakes Naval Training Center. This is September 1973. This is a gunnery school operator, and he was told to deliver an important letter to a commanding officer who is at one of these Quonset-style buildings. This is page 89, case A7. So he's met by these two very strong, muscular CBMP types. They escort him down this corridor. They make a left-hand turn into another corridor. That leads to this large open hangar area. And when he gets in, he sees this craft. This is about 35 feet in diameter. It was 12 feet tall. It was a teardrop-shaped UFO. Could be a USO, unidentified submerged object. There was a ridge that went from the leading edge of the craft all the way up through the spine to the trailing edge of the craft, and there was a blue coronal discharge that was on the leading edge of the craft. Now, as he's walking in and sees this, he hands this letter to the commanding officer, and this is kind of a SolidWorks rendering of what this craft may have looked like, according to the witness report. This whole craft is propped up on a 2-foot-tall wooden platform. He delivers the letter, he makes an about face, gets a glimpse-eye view of this thing, and then departs the area. But he did get a good look at this. And there's a B section to this story, because 2 weeks prior to his encounter, he met a sailor. And this sailor told him that, you know what, a little while ago, I was on this missile destroyer, and we shot down this interesting teardrop-shaped craft that was about 35 feet across, and very interesting. It was brought to Hawaii, the mainland, back in 1973. And then he went on to say that none other than Howard Hughes's Glomar Explorer was used to lift this craft off the bottom of the ocean and brought it back to San Diego and then to Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Chicago. So now we've got Howard Hughes involved. How CIA divers retrieve Russian secrets. This is San Francisco Examiner, March 19th, 1975. This is part of that codename Project Jennifer. A matter of risk, the incredible inside story of the CIA's Hughes Glomar Explorer mission to raise a Russian submarine. So during 1973 to 1974, a Russian submarine was recovered from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The question is that all that was recovered? According to RK's informant, the object was retrieved by the Glomar Explorer, shipped to Hawaii, and then sent stateside and finally to Chicago. A sketch of the craft was drawn by the sailor, and according to RK, who is our source, there was little doubt that it was the same object that he had seen in the Quonset-style hut. So again, we had independent confirmation. Next case. This was an office worker at the Pentagon back in 1952. She had gone, perhaps in the basement, through these double doorways that said off limits, and now she's in this dark, dim, dusty room. There's a couple of cardboard boxes off to the side, very poorly lit. She kind of makes this turn, and she is met with the shock of her life. She turns the corner, and she sees a pickled alien in a glass jar. This is what she sees. Within 5 seconds, she feels this hand on her shoulder. It was an MP telling her to get out of there immediately. She had to sign multiple NDA agreements not to talk about it. Stringfield Research got to her years later, where she did talk about it very briefly. Leonard Stringfield got in a call to her. She didn't want to discuss it, and that was the end of the story. This is back in 1952 at the Pentagon, right down the road here. So that'd be interesting if we can get access to that facility. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, 1955. Mrs. G, very interesting case. She worked in the Materials Division, Foreign Materials Division. This is page 17. And this is kind of the scene that we want to look at here, kind of the ending scene of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. You've got this large warehouse. We've got all these crates here. This is the environment that she was working in. And you can see this is Warehouse Building 258. Now, what her job was absolutely critical to this whole account here. What she said, this is Mrs. G, that she was charged to catalog 1,000 components that came in from a UFO crash retrieval. Can you imagine 1,000 components? So what they had set up here is they had an assembly line. So I told Rudy, I want you to give me this assembly line. They had one person over here taking photographs of this debris that came in from a crash retrieval. Over here, they had a gentleman that was bagging and tagging this debris. And then finally, off to the right, you can see this, our worker here, she is cataloging all this debris. Now all this debris is going up into the shelving. So we've got 1,000 components from a UFO crash retrieval. Interesting quote, this is from Mrs. G. Quote, Uncle Sam can't do anything to me once I'm in my grave. 6 months later, she died. We just got her in time. She's an American hero. She deserves credit for coming forward and giving us her account. Now, this is the actionable item here. Since over 1,000 components of physical ET hardware exists, according to Mrs. G, this evidence should be tracked down by senators and congressmen with the appropriate security clearances and should be presented in open public congressional hearings. That's what we're fighting for. That's the crusade here. So next time you hear about senators and congressmen testify at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. and state that they don't have any visual or physical evidence of UFOs, be advised that they have been illegally denied access to the material. That could be what we're dealing with here. Reference 18. Alien autopsy performed at Walter Reed Hospital. The cadaver was described as being 3 feet in height with a large head, protruding brow, sunken eyes which wrapped around the side of the face, very long arms, gray skin. This is pathologist report at the Cleveland Clinic back in 1952-1953 time frame. So if we take this pathologist report, we take his written report, we tie that together with all the eyewitnesses that have seen these bodies. What did these ET bodies look like if we were at a crash retrieval operation? That's the question. What do these things look like? These are the bullet items here. 3.5 to 4 feet tall, 4.5 feet tall. 2 round almond sunken in eyes without pupils. Heavy brow ridge. Large hairless head by human standards. No earlobes. No definitive nose. Small slit for a mouth. Very thin neck. Small torso wearing a metallic flexible garment. Arms described as long and thin, reaching down to the knees. Hands have 4 fingers without thumb. Slight webbing. Short and thin legs, no toes. Skin color beige, tan, brown, tan, pinkish gray. That's according to the pathologist reports, people who were on these autopsies. So if we take all this information together from the pathologist report and we put a composite sketch of one of these bodies together, this is what we're going to end up with, according to the pathologist report. I believe this to be the most accurate depiction of what these beings look like, according to the crash retrieval military witnesses and medical personnel who are on these autopsy teams. Very, very interesting configuration. We've got the large oversized head. We've got the oversized eyes. We've got the heavy brow ridge, emaciated frame, arms that go down below the knees, webbing on the fingers. It tracks with what these pathologists and medical personnel are telling us here. So, who's running the show here? Who's actually got control of this information? We want to look at Senator Daniel Inouye. Very courageous man. He absolutely deserves credit for what he was involved in. He made a very interesting statement during the Iran-Contra hearings that we should look at here. This is Tampa Tribune, August 4th, 1987. The hearing, said Inouye, produced a vision of a secret government directed principally by National Security Council staffers accountable to not a single elected official, including apparently the president himself. A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own interests of national interest, free from all checks and balances and the law itself. Great quote by Daniel Inouye. So we can see here, we've got the defense contractors in bed with the intelligence agency, and they have no congressional oversight, no public scrutiny here. So what's really the bottom line here? The entire body of ET crash retrieval evidence points to a sophisticated multi-decade cover-up which has concealed ET craft, debris, and bodies from the general public and members of Congress. These assets have been spread out over multiple military installations around the country in an effort to conceal the truth from the public and also to reverse engineer their advanced energy and propulsion systems. With new legislation now in place, previously hesitant top secret witnesses should feel more confident to come forward, thereby preserving an important part of our national history. And that is the crusade that we're working for. This is the crusade that Dr. Greer is working for, and I absolutely want to thank you for your attention.